A man can build an empire of glass and steel, commanding the world from a throne 80 stories high. Jonathan Davenport was such a man. His name was a weapon in boardrooms and a whisper on Wall Street. He had everything, and he controlled it all. But what happens when that control shatters, not from a market crash, but from a single, folded piece of paper? This is the story of how a billionaire, a titan of industry, was brought to his knees in his own penthouse, not by a rival or a scandal, but by the quiet, steady hands of his maid, and a secret she carried for 25 years. The penthouse was less a home and more a statement. Perched atop Davenport Tower on the edge of Central Park, it was a monument to Jonathan Davenport's unassailable success. Its walls were glass. Its floors were Italian marble, so polished they mirrored the perpetual grey of the Manhattan sky, and its furniture was a collection of stark, minimalist pieces that looked more like art installations than places to sit. It was a cold, quiet kingdom, and Jonathan was its undisputed king. At 52, Jonathan possessed a face that looked as if it were carved from the same granite as the buildings he financed. His silver-streaked hair was impeccably styled, his suits were bespoke, Brioni, and on his wrist, a Patek Philippe Grandmaster. Chime marked the passage of time in increments of power and profit. He moved through his world with an economy of motion, a man who had long ago eliminated any gesture, word, or emotion that did not serve a direct purpose. His life was a series of transactions, and he was always on the winning side. His staff operated with the same sterile efficiency. They were ghosts in his machine, a chef he rarely saw, a driver he never spoke to, beyond destinations, and a housekeeper, Ms. Grace Holloway, who had been a silent fixture in his life for nearly a decade. Grace was a woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes that held a depth of wisdom Jonathan had never bothered to notice. She was a black woman of profound dignity, her movements graceful and deliberate as she dusted his sterile sculptures and straightened his unread books. To Jonathan, she was part of the background, a reliable component of his well-ordered life. He paid her exceptionally well to be invisible, and she had always fulfilled her role perfectly. She would enter while he was at his office at Davenport Industries, and the penthouse would be immaculate upon his return. On the rare occasions their paths crossed, she would offer a quiet, "Good evening, Mr. Davenport," and he would reply with a curt nod, his mind already on the Nikkei index or a hostile takeover bid. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, however, the routine was broken. Jonathan was standing before the floor-to-ceiling window, a tumbler of Macallan 25 in his hand, watching the city's yellow cabs flow like blood cells through the concrete arteries below. He was contemplating the acquisition of a German tech firm, running numbers and strategies through his mind with the cold precision of a supercomputer. "Mr. Davenport." The voice was soft but clear, cutting through his concentration. He turned his brow furrowed in annoyance. It was Grace. She was not supposed to be here. Her hours were from 9 to 3. It was now 4:30. More than that, she was standing in the center of the living room, a place she was never meant to occupy while he was present. She was breaking protocol. "Ms. Holloway," he said, his voice clipped. "Is there a problem with the plumbing, the electricity?" It was the only reason he could fathom for her presence and her direct address. "No, sir. Everything is in order." She stood with a ramrod straight posture, her hands clasped in front of her. She was wearing her simple black uniform, but today it seemed less like a uniform and more like the formal attire of an emissary. In her gloved hands, she held a single thick cream-colored envelope. "Then I suggest you remember your schedule," Jonathan said, turning back to the window, a clear dismissal. She did not move. "I apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Davenport. But I was asked to give this to you, personally." He let out an exasperated sigh and turned back, his patience worn thin. He hated disruptions. He hated things that were not planned, that were not on his calendar. He extended a hand impatiently. "A message from the building management. Your own resignation. Whatever it is, give it here. You can see yourself out." Grace took 3 deliberate steps forward and placed the envelope into his outstretched hand. The paper was heavy, expensive. It was not from building management. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at her. For the first time in 10 years, he actually saw her. He noticed the fine lines of resolve around her mouth, the unwavering clarity in her dark eyes. There was no fear in them, only a profound, unsettling gravity. "Who asked you to give me this?" he demanded. "A woman I knew for a very long time." Grace said, her voice even. Her name was Rosalind. The name hit Jonathan like a physical blow. It was a ghost from a past he had systematically buried under 2.5 decades of relentless ambition. Rosalind Pierce. A painter. A whirlwind of color, chaos, and emotion from a brief, torrid affair in his late 20s, just before his first major acquisition. It was a lifetime ago. A different man. "I don't know anyone by that name," he lied, his voice a low growl. It was an automatic defense, the same way a fortress lowers its drawbridge at the sight of an unknown rider. Grace's expression did not flicker. "With all due respect, sir, you do. You asked her to disappear." And she did. She passed away last Thursday. Jonathan stared at the envelope in his hand. It was sealed with a simple wax stamp, no insignia. His heart a muscle he rarely paid. Any mind began to beat a heavy, unfamiliar rhythm against his ribs. He felt a crack appear in the icy facade of his world. He looked at Grace, then at the letter. His entire empire was built on knowing every variable controlling every outcome. And in this woman's quiet gaze in this heavy piece of paper was a variable he hadn't accounted for in 25 years. With a flick of his thumb, he broke the seal. The air in the penthouse seemed to thin, growing sharp and cold in Jonathan's lungs. The familiar cityscape outside, a testament to his power, blurred into an abstract pattern of light and shadow. The only thing in focus was the letter. His hands, usually so steady they could sign billion-dollar contracts without a tremor, felt strangely numb as he unfolded the single sheet of paper. The handwriting was Rosalind's. He recognized it instantly. It was elegant, yet forceful, a series of bold, sweeping loops and sharp, decisive strokes, just like the artist herself. It was the handwriting of a woman who felt everything deeply. He began to read. "My dearest Jonathan, if you are reading this, it means my time is up. It's a strange thing, knowing the end is near. It makes you look back, not on your successes or failures, but on your truths and your secrets. And you, Jonathan, are connected to my biggest secret. My greatest truth." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He could feel Grace's eyes on him, a silent, judging presence. He wanted to order her out, to burn the letter, to pretend this moment never happened. But he kept reading, compelled by a force stronger than his own formidable will. "I don't write to you for pity or for money. I know you have plenty of one and a distaste for the other. I write to you because a story is ending, and you must know how it began. Do you remember that summer, the one you spent plotting your first takeover of Sterling Finch? You told me I was a beautiful distraction. I told you that you were a magnificent hurricane. I think we were both right." He remembered. He remembered her small, paint-spattered apartment in Greenwich Village, the smell of turpentine and wine, the way she would laugh, throwing her head back without a care in the world. He had been drawn to her wild, untamable spirit, a stark contrast to his own rigid ambition, and he had discarded her just as ruthlessly when she became an inconvenience to that ambition. He had his lawyer, a young and hungry Robert Miller, deliver a check and a non-disclosure agreement. He never saw her again. He had convinced himself it was a clean cut. When I told you I was pregnant, I saw the look in your eyes. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even fear. It was calculation. You looked at me, at our unborn child, and you saw a liability, an obstacle on your path to greatness. You offered me a solution, a discreet clinic, a generous payment to fix the problem. You told me it was the only logical choice. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. He had forgotten that part. Or rather, he had chosen to forget it. He remembered the conversation, now the cold, clinical way he had presented it, as a business proposition. Her tears, his impatience. I took the check you sent later, the one meant to buy my silence forever. But I didn't go to the clinic, Jonathan. I couldn't. I used that money to disappear just as you wanted. I moved to a small town in upstate New York, far from your world of glass towers and golden parachutes. And there I had our son. Jonathan's breath hitched. He physically staggered back a step, one hand instinctively reaching for the back of a cold leather armchair to steady himself. Our son. The words detonated in the silent room. An entire universe of possibilities he had never considered, never allowed himself to consider, rushed into the vacuum. A son. His son. He was beautiful. He had your determined eyes, but my smile. I named him Benjamin. I couldn't give him your name that would have put him on your radar, and I knew your world would crush his gentle soul. I wanted him to have a life filled with love, not leverage. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I gave him up for adoption to a wonderful couple, a teacher and a carpenter, who could give him the stability and warmth I couldn't provide alone. I have watched him from a distance his whole life. He is 25 years old now. He is brilliant, kind, and honorable. He is everything good in both of us with none of your ruthlessness. He graduated with honors from Columbia on a scholarship he earned all by himself. I am telling you this now because he deserves to know his own story. And you deserve to know what you threw away. It wasn't a liability, Jonathan. It was a son. The letter trembled in his hands. He read the final lines, his world tilting on its axis. Don't try to find him using your army of lawyers and investigators. You don't need them. You're a man who prides himself on seeing every detail, every asset, every line on a balance sheet. The irony is, you've been looking right at him and seeing nothing at all. The person who delivered this letter, Grace Holloway, is my cousin. She has honored my dying wish. Ask her. She will tell you the truth. Goodbye, Jonathan. Rosalind. The letter slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the marble floor. Grace Holloway is my cousin. The information was a second explosion, more powerful than the first. He looked up at Grace, his carefully constructed reality completely pulverized. This woman, this quiet, invisible employee, was not just a housekeeper. She was a Trojan horse in his home, a guardian, a spy, a keeper of the most monumental secret of his life. He tried to speak, to form a word, a curse, a question, a command, but nothing came out. The air was stolen from his lungs. The strength in his legs, the same legs that had strode confidently into boardrooms to dismantle corporations, gave way. Jonathan Davenport the King, in his glass castle, fell to his knees. The sound of his impact on the cold marble echoed in the cavernous room. It was not a loud noise, but it was the sound of an empire collapsing, not from the outside, but from within. He knelt there, staring at the fallen letter, a white flag of surrender, in a war he never knew he was fighting. The silence that followed Jonathan's collapse was profound. It was heavier than the thick soundproofing of the penthouse windows, deeper than the abyss between the skyscrapers outside. On his knees, the master of the universe was reduced to a man staring at a piece of paper, his entire identity shattered by a ghost's handwriting. The polished marble was cold and unyielding against his expensive suit trousers, a hard reality pressing up against him. His first coherent thought was not one of grief or paternal yearning, but of pure, unadulterated rage. It was the rage of a man whose control had been utterly wrested from him. He felt exposed, manipulated. He pushed himself up his movements, stiff and clumsy, and turned his blazing eyes on Grace. "You," he hissed the word laced with venom. How long Grace did not flinch. Her composure was a dam against his fury. Rosalind contacted me shortly after she gave Benjamin up for adoption. She asked me to keep an eye on things should the need ever arise. When a position opened up here 10 years ago, it felt like providence. I took it. Providence? Jonathan laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You spied on me in my own home. For a decade, he paced back and forth, his mind racing, trying to reframe the situation into a familiar narrative. This had to be a scheme, a shakedown. This is about money, isn't it? This elaborate, decade-long plot. You and this boy, you think you found the golden goose. What's your price? Name it. $1,010,000. Everyone has a price. He was back on his feet, literally and figuratively trying to regain control by turning the situation into a transaction, the only language he truly understood. Grace's expression finally shifted. A flicker of profound disappointment, almost pity, crossed her face. Mr. Davenport, for 10 years I have cleaned your home. I have washed the glasses you drink from, made the bed you sleep in, and polished the tables where you sign your billion-dollar deals. If I wanted your money, I could have found 1,000 easier ways to get it. This has never been about your wealth. It was about my promise to a dying woman. It was about a boy who deserved to have his truth protected until the right time. Her words were calm, measured, and they disarmed him more effectively than any shout could have. His anger faltered, replaced by a churning sea of confusion and a terrifying, unfamiliar vulnerability. "Who is he?" Jonathan demanded, his voice cracking. "The letter. It says I've been looking at him." "What does that mean? Is he a doorman in this building? An analyst on the trading floor? Who is he?" He grabbed a crystal paperweight from his desk, his hand clenching and unclenching around it, needing something solid to hold on to as his world turned to liquid. Grace shook her head slowly. Rosalind was right. You see assets and employees, not people. You are not ready to meet him, Mr. Davenport. Not like this. Your first instinct was to treat this news as a threat, a negotiation. You think you can buy a son. You would walk into his life like one of your corporate raids, all hostile intentions and collateral damage. You would destroy him before you even knew his name. That is not for you to decide, he roared, slamming the paperweight down on the glass desk. A spiderweb of cracks instantly appeared on the surface. You will tell me who he is? Now, no. The single word spoken so softly, yet with such unshakable conviction, stopped him cold. No one said no to Jonathan Davenport. Not his board, not his rivals, not heads of state. And yet this woman, his housekeeper, had just denied him the single most important piece of information in his life. He stared at her, breathing heavily, the two of them locked in a standoff. He was the man with all the power, and she was the woman with all the truth. I am honoring Rosalind's last wish, Grace continued, her voice softening slightly. She didn't want him to be another one of your possessions, Mr. Davenport. She wanted him to have a chance at having a father, a real one. And that man is not the man I see before me right now. When you are ready to see a son instead of an heir, a person instead of a problem, then we can talk. Until then, my work here is done." She turned and walked towards the service elevator, her movements as composed as ever. "Holloway," he shouted a desperate last-ditch command. "You are fired. Do you hear me? You're fired." She paused at the door, her back still to him. "I know, sir," she said, without a trace of anger or fear. "I quit 10 minutes ago, when I handed you that letter." The service elevator dinged softly, the doors slid open, and she was gone. Jonathan was left alone in the wreckage of his pristine, orderly world. The cracked desk, the forgotten glass of whiskey, the letter on the floor. He was surrounded by the trappings of immense wealth and power, but he had never felt so utterly impoverished, so completely powerless. The king was alone in his fortress, and the walls were closing in. He sank into his chair, the cracked glass beneath his fingertips, a perfect metaphor for his shattered life. For the first time, he was faced with a problem his money couldn't solve, a negotiation he had already lost, and a question he had no way to answer. Who was his son? The night was a blur of expensive whiskey and formless dread. Jonathan didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, the city lights mocking him with their brilliance as memories he had long suppressed clawed their way to the surface. To understand the present, he was forced to exhume the past. He was 27 again. Not the titan of industry, but a predator on the rise. He was all sharp edges and relentless drive, fueled by a deep-seated fear of the mediocrity he'd grown up in. His father had been a moderately successful accountant, a man content with his small suburban life, and Jonathan had despised that contentment. He craved impact dominance. He was in the middle of his first major play, the hostile takeover of Sterling Finch, an old-money textile company ripe for asset stripping. It was all he thought about, all he cared about. And then he met Rosalind Pierce. He'd been dragged to a gallery opening in Greenwich Village by a potential investor. He hated the art world, finding it self-indulgent and impractical. He was about to leave when he saw her. She wasn't looking at the art. She was arguing passionately with the gallery owner, her hands covered in streaks of cobalt blue and cadmium yellow paint, her wild, dark curls escaping from a loose bun. She was vibrantly, unapologetically alive. He was intrigued. She was the antithesis of his world of spreadsheets and legal documents. He introduced himself, and for the next 3 months, she became his obsession, his beautiful distraction. Their time together was a whirlwind. He would leave the brutal, sterile environment of his office and descend into her chaotic, colorful world. Her apartment was a mess of canvases, books, and wine bottles. They would talk for hours, he about his ambitions, she about her art. He saw her as an exotic creature, a temporary respite from the war he was waging on Wall Street. He never considered her a permanent part of his life plan. The memory of the crucial conversation, the one he had forced himself to forget, returned with sickening clarity. They were in her apartment. The air was thick with the smell of oil paint. She had told him she was pregnant, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. He remembered the cold logic that had instantly taken over his mind. A child, a complication, a claim on his future earnings, a distraction from the Sterling Finch deal. He hadn't seen a baby. He'd seen a line item in the liabilities column. "We'll handle it," he'd said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I know a place. Very discreet. It's for the best, Rosalind. We're not that. My life is on a very specific trajectory right now." The hope in her eyes died. He saw it extinguish like a candle flame in a sudden draught. She had looked at him as if he were a stranger, a monster wearing the face of the man she thought she knew. "Is that all it is to you?" she had whispered. Something to be handled. It's the logical choice, he had insisted, unable to comprehend her emotional response. It's clean. We can both move on. She didn't argue further. A quiet, devastating heartbreak settled over her. A few days later, he had his lawyer, Robert Miller, who was now his long-serving general counsel, draft the NDA and cut the check. $50,000. It had seemed like a fortune to him then. A small price to pay to secure his future. He told himself it was a clean break. He won his bid for Sterling Finch, the first of many victories that paved his path to billions. He never looked back. Now, sitting in his silent penthouse, the memory was an indictment. He hadn't just been ambitious, he had been cruel. He had treated a human life, his own child, as an inconvenience. Grace's words echoed in his ears. You see assets and employees, not people. She was right. He had been that way even then. He thought of Grace. He pulled up her employee file on his tablet. Grace Holloway, born in Charleston, South Carolina. Next of kin, Rosalind Pierce, cousin. The information had been there all along, a dormant fact in his system he had never once looked at. He saw her resume a string of housekeeping jobs at high-end hotels and residences. There was a 10-year gap, the 10 years she had worked for him. He imagined her life a parallel narrative to his own. While he was closing deals and gracing the covers of business magazines, she was quietly watching a silent guardian in his inner sanctum. The pieces clicked into place. Rosalind hadn't just sent a letter. She had sent an auditor of his soul. Grace's presence in his house was a testament to Rosalind's foresight. She knew him so well. She knew he would dismiss the letter as a hoax or a shakedown if it came from a stranger. But it came from Grace, a woman he trusted implicitly, even if he never acknowledged her existence. Her quiet, decade-long service was the ultimate voucher for the letter's authenticity. It was a strategy so brilliant, so patient, it was worthy of a corporate takeover. The irony was crushing. In his quest for absolute control, he had invited the single greatest threat to his carefully managed world into his home, and he had paid her to be there. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the awakening city. He was a builder of empires, a man who could bend markets to his will. But he had failed at the most fundamental human level. He had a son, a 25-year-old man walking the same city streets, breathing the same air. And Jonathan had no idea who he was. The hunt was on. But Grace was right about one thing. He couldn't use his usual weapons, his lawyers, his investigators, his money. This wasn't a business problem. He had to find his son. But first, he had to find the part of himself he had killed off 25 years ago in a small, paint-spattered apartment in Greenwich Village. He had to find his own humanity. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in controlled chaos. Jonathan Davenport, a man accustomed to delegating every task, found himself mired in a deeply personal investigation. He couldn't trust his usual team. He couldn't call Robert Miller his consigliere and say, "Find the illegitimate son I tried to have aborted 25 years ago." This was a secret he had to unearth himself. His starting point was the letter. He graduated with honors from Columbia on a scholarship he earned all by himself. Jonathan's mind, a finely tuned machine for data analysis, went to work. He didn't need an outside investigator. He had one of the most powerful corporate machines in the world at his disposal. He focused his search internally. Davenport Industries had a prestigious internship program, heavily recruiting from Ivy League schools like Columbia. It was a long shot, but Rosalind's final words, "You've been looking right at him and seeing nothing at all," haunted him. It suggested proximity. He bypassed his own HR department, knowing a request for a list of all Columbia graduates from the last few years would raise flags. Instead, he used his top-level clearance to access the raw data server himself. In the sterile silence of his office on the 80th floor, surrounded by panoramic views of his domain, he began to cross-reference employee and intern data. He was searching for a ghost. He filtered for males aged 24 to 26, hired in the last 3 years, with an undergraduate degree from Columbia University. The list that appeared on his screen contained over 100 names. It was a start, but it was too broad. He needed more. What else did he know Rosalind had given the boy up for adoption? His last name would not be Davenport or Pierce. It could be anything. He thought of Grace. How did she connect the boy to him? The internship. It was the only logical way. Grace must have helped him get a foot in the door. He accessed the internship application archives, a digital mountain of resumes and cover letters. He began a keyword search, a desperate gamble. He searched for Grace Holloway's name as a reference. Nothing. He searched for Rosalind Pierce. Nothing. He cursed, frustrated. Grace was too smart for that. He was thinking like a CEO looking for a paper trail. He needed to think like a protective mother, a secretive cousin. The connection would be subtle, hidden. He went back to the list of 100 names. He began opening the files one by one, scanning photos, resumes, and performance reviews. It was a grueling process. Each face was a young, ambitious man, a reflection of what he might have been, but they sparked no recognition. He saw analysts, coders, junior marketers. He saw the cogs in his own machine. Hours bled together. The sun set and the city transformed into a glittering tapestry of lights. His dinner went untouched. He was fueled by coffee and a gnawing obsession. He was on the 78th name on the list when he saw it. Name Benjamin Carter, age 25. Position intern, R&D division. Education, Columbia University. B.S. in mechanical engineering, summa cum laude. Scholarship, the John and Mary Carter. Educational trust. There was no overt connection. The name Carter meant nothing to him. But then he opened the attached photo. The face that looked back at him from the screen was unnervingly familiar. The young man had a friendly, open expression. But his eyes, they were Jonathan's eyes. The same intense steel-grey color, the same focused gaze that could dissect a business proposal from 20 feet away. And his smile, a slight, almost shy upturn of the lips that was pure Rosalind. It was the smile he remembered from that gallery, the one that had momentarily pierced through his armor of ambition. His breath caught in his throat. Benjamin Carter. He tore through the digital file. Ben had been with the company for 6 months. His direct supervisor had given him glowing reviews. Exceptionally bright, a natural problem solver. Quiet but highly innovative. He was part of a team developing new sustainable energy solutions, a pet project of Jonathan's that he personally reviewed every quarter. Jonathan's blood ran cold. He had been in meetings with this team, 3 of them, in fact. He remembered them now, a series of faces all blurred together, presenting data on photovoltaic efficiency. He had been in the same room as his own son, separated by a 30-foot mahogany table, and he hadn't even registered his existence. He had probably looked right through him, his mind on the profit margins, not the people. You've been looking right at him and seeing nothing at all. The final damning piece of evidence was in the application's reference section. Ben hadn't listed Grace, but he had listed his adoptive father, John Carter, a high school woodshop teacher. For his personal reference, he listed a man named Dr. William Evans, his university mentor. But Jonathan, in his deep dive, pulled the security logs for building access. He checked the visitor logs for Benjamin Carter's interview day 7 months ago. The name of the person who signed him in at the front desk, using a guest pass authorized by a mid-level HR manager, was not Ben's. It was Grace Holloway's. She had personally escorted him to the interview, a quiet, unseen hand guiding her charge into the lion's den. The puzzle was solved. The ghost had a name and a face. A wave of something akin to nausea washed over Jonathan. He remembered the last R&D meeting. He had been particularly harsh, tearing into their projections, calling their progress anemic. He remembered a young man, Ben, speaking up tentatively, offering a counter-argument about a new polymer they were testing. Jonathan had cut him off mid-sentence. "We don't pay you to be tentative, son," he had snapped. "Bring me results, not theories." He had called his own son with the casual, condescending dismissal he used with any junior employee. The weight of that memory of all the missed moments of a lifetime of ignorance was unbearable. He had found his son. But in doing so, he had also found a man he despised himself, the ruthless, arrogant billionaire who had looked his own child in the eye and saw only an underperforming asset. He knew he had to see him. Not in a boardroom, not as a CEO. He had to face the boy he had discarded, and the man that boy had become, in spite of him. He picked up his phone, his hand shaking, and dialed his personal assistant. "Clear my schedule for tomorrow," he said, his voice hoarse. "And get me a home address for an intern named Benjamin Carter." Ben Carter lived in a modest fourth-floor walk-up in Astoria, Queens. The building was pre-war brick with a fire escape zigzagging down its front, a world away from the gleaming steel and glass of Jonathan's Manhattan, as Jonathan's Maybach, a silent black behemoth, purred to a stop at the curb. It looked as out of place as a shark in a koi pond. Jonathan had spent the entire morning rehearsing what he would say, drafting and deleting mental scripts. Should he be direct, apologetic? Should he bring a lawyer? He dismissed that last thought immediately. This was the one mess he couldn't litigate his way out of. He had decided on a simple, direct approach, but now, sitting in the plush leather interior of his car, staring at the unassuming entrance to the building, every rehearsed line felt hollow and absurd. How do you summarize a 25-year-old lie? He got out of the car, telling his driver to wait. He wore a simple cashmere sweater and slacks, a conscious decision to appear less intimidating, less Mr. Davenport. But there was no shedding the aura of power that clung to him like a second skin. As he walked up the concrete steps, he felt the nervous energy of a teenager on a first date, a feeling so alien it was disorienting. He found apartment 4B and stood before the simple wooden door. He could hear faint music from within, some kind of indie rock. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What right did he have to be here, to shatter this young man's life with his presence? The answer was none. But he knocked anyway, 3 sharp raps that sounded like gunshots in the quiet hallway. The door opened a moment later. And there he was. Benjamin Carter. His son. He was taller than Jonathan had realized, with a lean, athletic build. He wore a faded t-shirt and jeans, and his dark hair was slightly messy. In his hand he held a spatula. He was clearly in the middle of making breakfast. His eyes, Jonathan's eyes, widened in shock. "Mr. Davenport, what are you doing here?" There was no recognition beyond that of an intern seeing the company's CEO at his front door. There was confusion, a hint of fear, am I being fired, but nothing more. "Benjamin," Jonathan began, his voice rougher than he intended. "May I come in? I need to speak with you about something important." "It's not about work." Ben hesitated, his mind clearly racing to understand this bizarre situation. He glanced back into his small, tidy apartment, then back at the billionaire standing in his hallway. He nodded slowly and stepped aside. "Oh, sure. Of course. Come in." The apartment was small but clean and bright. One wall was lined with bookshelves, crammed with engineering textbooks and science fiction novels. A half-assembled robotics project sat on a coffee table. It was the space of a curious, intelligent mind. It was a home. "I'm sorry to intrude like this," Jonathan said, standing awkwardly in the middle of the living room. "No, it's fine," Ben said, putting the spatula down on his small kitchen counter. "Can I get you something? Water coffee?" "No, thank you. Please sit." They sat opposite each other, Ben on his worn-out sofa, Jonathan on a simple wooden chair. The silence was thick with unspoken questions. Jonathan decided to abandon all pretense. "This is going to be very difficult to hear." He started his gaze, fixed on Ben's face, searching for some sign, any sign. And there is no easy way to say it. He took a deep breath. 25 years ago, I knew a woman, a painter. Her name was Rosalind Pierce. At the mention of the name, Ben's posture changed. The polite confusion in his eyes hardened into a guarded, intense watchfulness. He knew the name. "She was my biological mother," Ben said quietly, his voice flat. "She passed away a little over a week ago." "I know," Jonathan said, his own voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry." "She was a remarkable woman." Ben's eyes narrowed. "How did you know her?" Here it was, the point of no return. Ben, Jonathan said, leaning forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "The reason I'm here, the reason Rosalind and I knew each other, is that I am your biological father." The words hung in the air between them, seeming to suck all the oxygen out of the small room. Ben stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief. He blinked once, twice, as if trying to reboot his understanding of reality. Then a humorless, broken laugh escaped his lips. "You," he said the word dripping with incredulity. "You're my father, Jonathan Davenport, the man who told me my team's work was anemic, and to stop wasting his time with theories." The memory, so raw for Jonathan, was clearly just as vivid for Ben. Jonathan flinched, as if he'd been struck. "That can't be right." Ben continued, shaking his head, more to himself than to Jonathan. My mother, she told my parents, my real parents, John and Mary Carter, that my biological father was a young artist. She knew someone who died before I was born. "She lied to protect you," Jonathan said, the shame tasting like ash in his mouth. "She lied to protect you from me." He saw the gears turning in Ben's mind, the confusion, the denial, and then the slow, dawning horror of comprehension. The story he had carried his whole life was a fiction. The truth was sitting in his living room, a cold, powerful stranger who had treated him with casual disdain. "So you just... What left her?" Ben asked, his voice rising with an anger that was entirely justified. "You just walked away when you found out she was pregnant. It was more complicated than that." Jonathan stammered the excuse, sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "Complicated?" Ben shot to his feet, his fists clenched. "It seems pretty simple to me. You're the man who destroyed my mother, aren't you? You're the reason she had to give me up. She never told me your name, but she told me about you. The rich, powerful man who saw her and his own child as an inconvenience. She spent her whole life looking over her shoulder, afraid you'd find her find me. That's you. You're him." The accusation, raw and filled with a lifetime of inherited pain, hit Jonathan with the force of a physical assault. This wasn't just an intern. This was a son who knew the very worst of him, a son who had grown up with the ghost of his cruelty. Jonathan began, but no words came. What could he say? "I'm sorry I've changed. They were meaningless platitudes in the face of such profound and righteous anger. Ben stood there breathing heavily, his face a storm of betrayal and rage. The brilliant young engineer was gone, replaced by a wounded son confronting the monster from his mother's stories. "Get out," Ben said, his voice low and trembling with fury. "Ben, please let me explain." Explain. What Ben roared, his composure finally shattering. Explain how you paid her off. Explain why, for 25 years, I didn't exist to you. There's nothing to explain. You're a poison. She knew it, and now I know it. Get out of my home. Now. He pointed a shaking finger at the door. There was no negotiation in his eyes, no room for appeal. It was a final verdict. Jonathan stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He had walked into this apartment hoping for a bridge, a connection. Instead, he had found a chasm of his own making, and he had just been pushed from the edge. He walked to the door, a defeated man. He paused with his hand on the knob and looked back at his son. "I am so sorry, Benjamin," he whispered. Ben didn't answer. He just stood there, his back to Jonathan, a silent, rigid pillar of judgment. Jonathan Davenport stepped out into the hallway and closed the door behind him, the quiet click sealing him off from the only thing in the world that now mattered. The drive back to Manhattan was a silent grey funeral procession for a future that had died before it could begin. The city Jonathan had conquered now seemed alien and hostile, its towering buildings like tombstones marking his colossal failure. Ben's words echoed in his mind. "You're a poison." He didn't go to his office. He went back to the penthouse, the glass fortress that now felt like a prison. For days he was adrift. He cancelled meetings, ignored calls from his board, and sent Robert Miller away with curt, dismissive replies. He drank not for pleasure, but for oblivion. He replayed the scene in Ben's apartment over and over, each time feeling the sting of his son's hatred, as if it were fresh. He was a problem solver. Every challenge in his life had been a complex equation he could solve with money power or ruthless strategy. But this was different. This wasn't an equation to be solved. It was a wound to be healed, and he was the one who had inflicted it. After 3 days, wallowing in self-pity and expensive scotch, a moment of clarity pierced through the haze. He thought of Grace, her quiet strength, her unwavering dignity. She had known the truth all along. She was the only person who understood the full scope of the wreckage. He found her address in his files, a small, neat house in a quiet neighborhood in Teaneck, New Jersey. He drove himself, taking a simple black sedan from his collection instead of the ostentatious Maybach. When he arrived, he didn't feel like a billionaire visiting his former maid. He felt like a penitent seeking a confessor. Grace opened the door before he could knock, as if she had been expecting him. She looked at his disheveled appearance, the stubble on his jaw, the exhaustion in his eyes, and simply nodded, stepping aside to let him in. Her home was the antithesis of his penthouse. It was warm, filled with books, family photos, and the smell of freshly baked bread. It was a place where life was lived, not just observed. "He hates me," Jonathan said, the words tumbling out before he even sat down. "He knows what I did to Rosalind. He wants nothing to do with me." Grace gestured to a comfortable armchair. "What did you expect, Jonathan?" she asked, using his first name for the first time. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but deeply sad. "Did you think you could walk in there, announce your identity, and he would embrace you? A boy's loyalty is to the mother who loved him, not the father who rejected him. What do I do?" He asked the question raw and stripped of all arrogance. It was the humblest question he had ever asked in his life. The Titan was asking for directions. You stop trying to acquire a son. Grace said, her gaze steady and clear. And you start trying to become a father. Fathers don't show up after 25 years with demands and expectations. They show up with patience, with humility, and with unconditional support, whether it is accepted or not. Rosalind didn't tell you about Ben so you could claim him. She told you so you would have a chance to redeem yourself. Her words were a beacon in his fog of despair. Redemption. It wasn't about getting Ben to love him. It was about becoming a man worthy of that love, even if he never received it. The journey back to Manhattan was different. He wasn't retreating to his prison. He was returning to his workshop. He had spent his life building an empire of wealth. Now he had to build something else. His first call was not to Ben, but to his lawyers. He instructed them to set up a charitable foundation. The Rosalind Pierce Foundation, dedicated to providing financial aid, housing, and support for single mothers and grants for children given up for adoption. He funded it with an initial endowment of $500 million, a significant portion of his personal fortune. It wasn't a gesture, it was a penance. It was an attempt to create a positive legacy from the wreckage of his biggest mistake. His second act was to write a letter. Not an email or a text, but a real letter, handwritten on simple stationery. Ben, I am not writing to ask for your forgiveness. I have no right to it. I am writing to tell you that you were right about me, about everything. I was a coward, a cruel and selfish man who made a choice that has haunted me even when I refuse to acknowledge it. I cannot change the past. I cannot undo the pain I caused your mother or the life I denied you. But I can spend the rest of my days trying to build something better on the ruins of my mistakes. I will not contact you again. I will not force my presence on you. I have sold my majority stake in Davenport Industries to a new leadership team, effective immediately. My name will no longer be on the building where you work. I want you to have a future free of my shadow. All I ask is that you know this. Learning that I had a son was the most important discovery of my life. You are without question the best thing I ever had a hand in creating. I am profoundly proud of the man you have become. Your parents, John and Mary, did a magnificent job. I hope one day you have a life filled with joy. Sincerely, Jonathan. He didn't sign it as father. He hadn't earned that title. He sent the letter via a simple courier with no return address. Months passed. Jonathan stepped away from the corporate world. He worked full-time at the foundation, reading grant applications, meeting with social workers. He learned about the struggles of women like Rosalind. He began to see people not just numbers. The fortress of the penthouse was sold. He moved into a smaller, more human-sized apartment downtown. One crisp autumn afternoon, he was sitting on a bench in Central Park reading. He looked up and saw a familiar figure walking down the path. It was Ben. He wasn't alone. He was walking with an older couple, a man with kind, weathered hands, and a woman with a warm smile. John and Mary Carter, his parents, his real family. Ben saw him. Their eyes met across the expanse of lawn. Jonathan's heart hammered in his chest. He expected Ben to turn away to lead his family in the other direction, but he didn't. He stopped. He said something to his parents, and they looked over at Jonathan. Mary Carter gave a small, sad smile. John Carter nodded a gesture of acknowledgement, not forgiveness, but something more than hate. Ben took a step forward, then another. He walked across the grass and stopped a few feet from Jonathan's bench. "I got your letter," Ben said. His voice was steady, the anger replaced by a quiet, somber contemplation. Jonathan simply nodded, unable to speak. The foundation. Ben continued, what you're doing for those women, for kids like me. It's a good thing. Rosalind would have liked it, Jonathan said softly. An understanding passed between them. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't a happy reunion. It was something more fragile and more real. It was the first tentative step onto a bridge built not of ambition or obligation, but of shared loss and the quiet hope for redemption. Ben didn't sit down. He just stood there for a long moment, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. I have to get back to my parents, he said. Of course, Jonathan replied. As Ben turned and walked away to rejoin the family that had raised him, Jonathan Davenport felt a profound sense of peace. He had lost an heir, an empire, and a lifetime of carefully constructed certainties. But sitting there on a simple park bench, a humbled man no longer on his knees, he felt for the first time in his life that he might just be on the path to finally becoming a father. The story of Jonathan Davenport isn't just about a billionaire's fall from grace. It's about a man's ascent into humanity. It teaches us that the highest walls we build are often within ourselves, and the most valuable truths are the ones that force us to tear them down. His journey from a cold-hearted titan to a humbled father reminds us that it is never too late to confront our past and try to build a better future, not with money or power, but with humility and sincere action. What do you think, can a man truly redeem himself after such a profound mistake? Is forgiveness something that can be earned, or is it a gift? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit the like button, share it with someone who appreciates a powerful tale of redemption, and be sure to subscribe for more stories that explore the depths of the human heart. Thank you for listening.